asked Jane if she would play that as an introduction, because in the time I served First United Methodist Church in downtown Syracuse, we had a Good Friday service that was a combination of other churches coming to our building. And in our congregation, we had, I shouldn't say an elderly woman, but she was toward elderly. Her name was Betty Mann. And she was a music teacher, but also played the cello in the Syracuse Symphony Orchestra. Every Good Friday, this is how we began the service. She played "O Sacred Head, Now Wounded." Now, she played in the orchestra, and at Christmas time, the Nutcracker always came. Well, I saw it once and thought, I've seen it. But there are those people, including my spouse, who wants to see it again every year. Well, I already know how it ends, so I thought, okay, I know it, but she wants to go every year. So we went frequently, and I would spend my time watching Betty in the orchestra pit. And over the years, Betty's ability to stand straight was compromised, because for all those years, she hunched over this big cello and played, and she couldn't even walk straight up anymore. But that's why I wanted to begin. Now, it's not a hymn that we sing very often in church, maybe on a Good Friday, but we don't have Good Friday services here. So anyway, that's why I wanted to begin with that. So we have some people online. We maybe even have more people online than we have right here this morning. So we're kind of the usual hybrid. So I don't know what camera I'm supposed to be looking at, but anyway, welcome to those of you who have joined us. I said a very quick hello to you. I'm glad you can join us this evening. And Mike, 3 years ago, we wouldn't have seen this through the windows.
Oh, that's right.
This is something unique in an evening where the sun is just blasting its way through, because we had those old compromised glass windows that wouldn't even let the sunlight in. So this is kind of unusual. So John and Sarah and Shirley and Jane have prepared a lot of stuff. I'm not a song leader. I'll never try to be. So John, the only little piece I'm going to play as a role tonight is to kind of usurp a little bit of what you do on Sunday morning with some background with the stories, but you folks are going to lead the singing. We often hear the phrase "a dark night of the soul," meaning troubled times. And all of us, I suppose, have lived through or are living through troubled times. You know, in our lives it might be anxiety, or it might be betrayal, it might be broken relationships, might be doubt, or illness, or loneliness, or loss, or misunderstandings. A whole lot of stuff constitute the dark night of the soul. And so that's why in your program I put that quote from Job, where the author of the book says, "God gives songs in the night." And these are the songs that we do tonight that help us get through the troubled times where we need some strength and direction. So that's kind of where we want to go with this. And we're going to do a couple of songs of prayer. And the first one is "Precious Lord, Take My Hand." And I purposely wanted to contrast what Jane played with how Shirley is going to play this hymn. At Rockefeller, John, you will remember, and maybe you, Sarah, we had Lori Mann as organist for years and years, and Lori decided she was going to go off in a different direction. So we were doing interviews for a new organist, and we'd gone through a couple, and there was this elderly gentleman who came to play. And most things he played, we had the choir there and a few other people sitting in the choir loft just listening to him. And most things he played fine, but everything was bang, crash, really loud. And it's like, there are some pieces of music that need to be soft. And I think "Precious Lord, Take My Hand" is one of those ones that is maybe better on the piano than it is on the organ. And there's a softness to it, partly because of the theme. And John, you've told this story, and I've told the story too, that this is an old gospel song that's attributed to a famous band leader named Thomas Dorsey.
Right.
But after some further investigation, that really is in question. That the real composer was a Thomas Andrew Dorsey, and his name is at the bottom of the page in the hymnal. And he was son of a black revivalist preacher. So not the Thomas Dorsey that we know as a figure. So in the early 1900s, this Thomas Dorsey was into blues and began playing at a vaudeville theater, and this was in Georgia. Eventually he moved to Chicago, and he played under, oh, guess what, the name Georgia Tom. And then he played something called barrel house piano. I want to know, what is barrel house piano?
You gotta find out.
Somehow it had to do with Al Capone and the speakeasies in Chicago, but I don't know any details
sounds like
about
gin mill.
what that kind of music is. Well, that's what he was into. So then he moved to St. Louis, and in the midst of a performance, he was handed a telegram. Now, we don't know what telegrams are anymore, right? I had 2 younger brothers born, and each time my parents shipped me 50 miles away to live the summer with my grandmother, because it would be easier for mom to, with a new baby, to have one less older child living around. My grandmother didn't have a telephone. So when my brothers were born, there was a Western Union telegram that came, and it said, Thomas Richard Fulton, born such and such a day, all is well, or Robert Eugene Fulton, born same thing. And that was how I knew that I had a baby brother. So anyway, this Mr. Dorsey gets a telegram saying, your wife just died. I mean, how do you react to that? So he rushed to the nearest phone and called home. He didn't even know who he was talking to at the other end. And all they could say over and over again in an excited voice is, Nettie is dead. Nettie is dead. So Thomas Dorsey gets a ride home all the way through the night. And he arrives home to learn that his baby boy had also died. So it was based on this experience that he wrote this hymn.
Wow.
So it's not only the music, it's the words that you couldn't sing this in a loud, clashy, bangy way.
No.
So it's number 474 in the hymnal, and I think it's short enough that we could sing all 3 stanzas.
Sure. Do you want me to stand up with John and
If you want
face
to,
that?
yeah.
Sure.
You get more camera time this way too.
Right.
Precious Lord, take my hand, lead me on, let me stand. I am tired, I am weak, I am worn. Through the storm, through the night, lead me on to the light. Take my hand, precious Lord, lead me on.
you've told this story here about in the garden. I had a professor of hymnology in seminary who was one of the most wonderful men I ever met, and a wonderful professor of music as well. But he had his hang-ups, and one was in the garden, and he just trashed this hymn. And so that influences us who were young, impressionable students back then. And it was halfway through my ministry, I think, when I ever, for the first time, put this hymn in a service. Because that prejudice had carried over, and eventually I was able to shed it, but it was halfway through my ministry. So there was this C. Austin Miles, and he was a pharmacist, and he began writing gospel songs, and eventually he became an editor of hymnals and assorted songbooks. But his hobby was, John, he was a photographer. He told us that one Sunday morning. And he found his dark room perfect for developing not only photos, but for studying the Bible. And he'd sit in this darkened room with blue light, and he would read his Bible amidst all the peace and the quiet. So he was developing some of his film, and he opened the Bible to what was his favorite story, the 20th chapter of John's Gospel, where Mary Magdalene is at the edge of the garden seeking Jesus. And we all know that story. And pictured Mary Magdalene as coming to the tomb. And so then he wrote the words to this hymn, and then that evening wrote the music. I can't comprehend of writing a whole hymn with all the words, and then later on, oh, by the way, after dinner, I think I'll sit down and write the music too. But anyway, that's the story that he did. It was popularized by Billy Sunday's revival circuit. Remember Billy Sunday?
Yeah.
He was a
Well, I don't remember him, but I've heard of
I
him.
remember hearing about it.
he was a professional baseball player.
Yeah.
One time he slid into home plate safely, got up, went to the dugout, and said to his teammates, "See ya, I'm off to a new profession," and then became the revivalist that he was. I read where later this was recorded and was one of the favorites of Roy Rogers and Dale Evans. Now, I was a great fan of both of them. I just absorbed their movies and TV and so forth. I never remember them singing this piece of music, but what I read says that they did. But remember Tennessee Ernie Ford?
Yeah.
That was a popular one with him.
Yeah.
Also Elvis Presley, Loretta Lynn. But I think most of all, I saw once or twice on TV Mahalia Jackson sing in the garden. And one of our bishops, Forrest Stitt, was once in the audience of a performance where she sang this, and it just drew out the emotion from everybody. So there are times, including tonight, when I'm okay with singing in the garden. So it's number 314, and I think, again, we could sing all three stanzas.
I come to the garden alone, while the bloom is still on the roses, and the voice I hear falling on my ear, the Son of God is For he bids me go through the voice of woe. His voice to me is calling. And he walks with me, and he talks with me, and he tells me I am his own. And the joy we cherish with tarry there, none other has ever known.
So John, you and Sarah are going to sing a piece together. Should I move a little bit? out
No,
of the way?
I think you're good, John.
Okay.
Sarah and I are going to sing a round. It's called When Jesus Wept, the Falling Tear. It's by William Billings, and Mr. Billings lived between 1746 and 1800, and first appeared with words in the New England Psalm Singer in 1770. It's associated with, well, I know, I went to an Anglican school, and we sang this all the time. 300 young boys singing four-part round. It was quite an experience. Maybe we're not going to try to duplicate that tonight, but it is a very, very pretty melody. So, Sarah and I are going to sing it in unison through it just once, and then we'll break into a little bit of a round. Shirley, can you plunk me a C? That's good. That'll do. That's fine.
Close enough?
Thank you. That's close enough for jazz, right?
Okay.
When Jesus wept the falling tear, in mercy flowed beyond the bounds. When Jesus rode, a trembling fear seized all the guilty world around. When Jesus wept the falling tear, in mercy flowed beyond the bounds. When Jesus rode, a trembling fear seized all the guilty world around. Seized all the guilty world around.
So the Old Rugged Cross is next. It's number 504. There was a time in recent history when us pastors here at Shenango rotated leading worship services in the Grand on Sunday afternoons. And so all of us had maybe 5 or 6 or 7 times through the year when we went there. It's always a challenge as to what you do for worship in a group like that. Sometimes you have to almost make it like a children's time because of the varied backgrounds and the conditions that the folks are in. But always we had a time where you could, indicate your favorite hymn. What do you want to sing? Well, there are hundreds of hymns in any songbook, and they were restricted to about 3. You never got any requests beyond those 3, and the top one, no matter what time of the year it was the Old Rugged Cross.
I know, I played for some of
Right?
those.
They would sing that to death and ignore the other 597 hymns that they had access to. The gentleman who was responsible for this hymn was named George Bernard, and he was born in Youngstown, Ohio. This was back in Civil War days, and his father was a coal miner, And they moved to Iowa from Ohio, and it was there that this George became a follower of Jesus thanks to the Salvation Army that was out there. And he decided that he wanted to enter the ministry. He was all set to do that, but as often happens in life, the father dies and the mother is left with other children, and it becomes a real economic issue in order to survive. So instead of going to seminary, he works by day and he devotes all his spare time to books. And so as a result of that study, not in seminary, he wrote the Old Rugged Cross. And I can still remember at the United Methodist Church downtown, we had this enormous grand piano at floor level. And the organist one time asked me if it would be okay, because this was the closing hymn, if it would be okay if instead of him playing the organ up in the balcony, really nice pipe organ, if he and the choir came down and went around the grand piano and played the Old Rugged Cross, and then the whole congregation would sing. I thought, Greg, you're in charge of the music. You know, if that's what you want to do, that's what we're going to do. And it interested me that as we sang the hymn, that there were two ladies and one gentleman. Both ladies pulled out Kleenex, and the other one pulled out a handkerchief. And they had moist eyes or were dabbing the tears from their cheeks. And I didn't quite know why all this was happening. And I discovered later that as they grew up, the family gathered around the old piano in the living room or the dining room. And this was one of the hymns that they sang all the time.
Yeah.
So anyway, the Old Rugged Cross, I think we're only going to do a couple of
1 and
songs.
4.
1 and 4.
1 and 4. Yeah,
Yeah.
1 and 4.
On a hill far away stood an old rugged cross, the emblem of suffering and shame. And I loved that old cross with the dearest and best, for a world of lost sinners was slain. So I cling to the old rugged cross till I find that day I lay down. I will cling to the old rugged cross and exchange it someday for a crown.
To the old rugged cross I will ever be true.
Its shame and reproach gladly bear. Then he'll call me someday to my home far away, where his glory forever I'll share. So I'll cherish the old rugged cross till my trophies at last I lay down. I will cling to the old rugged cross till exchange it someday for a crown.
Isaac Watts is one of my favorite composers. Wrote some great stuff, Oh God, Our Help in Ages Past. Also, Joy to the World, which we're singing on Sunday. You know, we picture that as a Christmas hymn.
Yeah.
There's no mention of Christmas in there at all. For that matter, there's no mention of Easter. But anyway, it's such a piece
Yeah.
that is, that to me, is so appropriate on Easter. Well, that was one of his centerpieces. Well, Isaac Watts was still a teenager, and he went to church because his father was a clergyman. You know, every Sunday, there, you know, it was just the routine. Well, he sits in there and he just gets so frustrated at the Anglican hymns. He thinks they are just the dregs. And you can remember that even in our country in the early years, that there would be a song leader or the pastor who was called lining a hymn. So you'd stand up there, and if it were me, I would read the line to the hymn, and then they'd sing it. And then I'd read the next line, and you'd sing it. Well, you talk about drudgery hymns. So anyway, Isaac didn't like this, and he complained to his father at dinner after church on one Sunday. And his father really took issue with young Isaac. He said, you know, if you don't like the hymns, you go ahead and write some on your own. Well, lo and behold, he did. And for the next 50-some Sundays, there was a new hymn from the pen of Isaac Watts. So anyway, when I survey the wondrous cross, it seems to be such a perfect blend, a paradox of sorrow and hope on the other hand. And medieval paintings depicted little angels flying around the cross with cups intending to catch the sorrow and the love flowing down. And I think one Sunday morning I had what was called a tear cup here that was used for various occasions. And so, you know, you picture these little tear cups capturing the tears of someone who was sad because of some life experience. There are those who think this was probably the best hymn that he ever wrote. And I remember back in the days when Charles Wesley was a significant hymn writer, not like how we perceive him in the Methodist Church today. Back then, Charles Wesley said, I would have traded all of my 6,500 hymns to have written this one hymn. He thought so highly of it. So anyway, I think we're going to do stanzas 1 and 3. And it's number 298. It is well with my soul.
That's a good one.
It is a good one, and I can still remember very important times when this was played in our respective lives. The story is a very familiar one about Horatio Spafford, who was an attorney living during the time of the Chicago fire, about 1870s. He was a very wealthy man, and most of his wealth was because of real estate. So all of a sudden, about the whole city burns down, and look at the predicament that he's in. So he stays to try to recoup as best he can, but decides eventually that he wants to send his wife and his 4 daughters to safety. At the same time, there was a revival being held in England. Dwight Moody and Ira Sankey, very familiar names. So he was going to come join them and be a participant in all of that. So he sends them on ahead of time, but it was about Thanksgiving in 1873, and there was a French liner carrying Horatio Spafford's family, and it collided with another ship, and in about 2 brief hours, the ship was gone. There were 226 fatalities, including all 4 of the Spafford daughters. But Mom survived, hanging on to a piece of wreckage until she was able to wind up being rescued and carried off to Cardiff, Wales. And there she contacted her husband. She sent a message saying simply, "Saved but alone." And so he decided he would, as quickly as he could, get over there to be with her. And the story goes, now whether this is history or whether it's urban legend or maybe a piece of both, that when they got about the spot where the ship had sunk, the captain told Horatio Spafford, who went up on deck and spent some time there, and immediately wrote this hymn. So we know he wrote the hymn, but we don't know for sure about those other details. So anyway, let's just sing the first stanza of 377. His eye is on a sparrow. We have never, ever had this hymn in any Methodist hymn book until this little black edition
Really?
came along.
Huh.
To me, of all that's in here, the cost of this black songbook was worth it, just to have that single hymn in it. Just like I would contend that we have the green supplement here too, and it is worth the cost of that to have back in our hymnal, "Love Lifted Me." It's worth the price to have access to just a handful of these. So most of what we have in here, we don't use very often, but there's just a handful, and this is one of the really good ones. Well, there was a school teacher, lover of music, and she married a Dr. Walter Martin, who was an evangelist. So we have a school teacher and an evangelist. And she would go with him on his evangelism trips and help him in any way he can. And so this is her account, word for word, of how this song came into being. Early in the spring of 1905, my husband and I were sojourning in Elmira, New York. We contracted a deep friendship for a couple by the name of Mr. and Mrs. Doolittle, true saints of God. Mrs. Doolittle had been bedridden for nigh 20 years. Her husband was an incurable cripple, language would be different today, who had to propel himself to and from his business in a wheelchair. Despite their afflictions, they lived happy Christian lives, bringing inspiration and comfort to all who knew them. One day while we were visiting with the Doolittles, my husband commented on their bright hopefulness and asked them for the secret of it. Mrs. Doolittle replied, "His eye is on the sparrow, and I know he watches me." The beauty of this simple expression of boundless faith gripped the hearts and fired the imagination of Dr. Martin and me. The hymn, "His Eye is on the Sparrow," was the outcome of that experience. So that's the tale, word for word. So in our little black book, it's 2146. 2146, and let's do stanzas 1 and 2.
Why should I feel discouraged? Why should I stand
There might be somebody here tonight who has the favorite, "Great is thy faithfulness." This is a real oldie. Hasn't been in every one of our United Methodist hymnals, but
Really?
it is now, and it is used frequently, and we sing it here frequently. It really is about the saddest book in the Bible is Lamentations in the Old Testament. The very name means weeping or wailing in grief. And Lamentations is the prophet Jeremiah's mournful cry of anguish over the suffering of Judah and Jerusalem. Remember, the southern kingdom was carried off into exile to Babylon. And so Jeremiah lived at about this time. And this is almost a postscript to the book of Jeremiah in the Old Testament. And so he's speaking about this one of the most miserable times in all the history of ancient Israel. And in the midst of this incomparable dirge, with all its tears and terror, comes one of the brightest jewels of the entire Bible, because what we sing in it is a quote from the 3rd chapter of the book of Lamentations. "For God's compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is God's faithfulness." So it's number 140, and let's do all 3 stanzas.
I
last hymn is Abide With Me. You ever sing this? Ever?
Yeah, I've
Yeah.
sung it before.
Have you done it on a Sunday morning or some special occasion?
Maybe a funeral or something?
Yeah, that would be more likely. Or an evening hymn, maybe. This is one of the few evening times we gather for worship, so yeah, maybe then. Well, the composer was a Henry Light, and he was a vicar, a clergyman in this little English fishing village. And he had been appointed there for 23 years. That is a long time in one congregation. Those of us who have been 16 years in one, we think that's a long time. Add another 7 to it, and that is really, really a long time. But as time went on, his personal health conditions changed and began to fail. And it was like a black cloud just hanging over him all the time. He was diagnosed with tuberculosis. And so he decided that the best way to escape the damp of this village along the water was he had a destination in Italy somewhere where it was going to be dry and not as humid and would be better for his health. So he was planning to do that. And he thought, I don't know how long I'm going to be gone or if I even have a chance to come back. So I'm going to walk along the rocky coast for one last time. And as a result of that, he composed this particular hymn. And you can just picture him walking along this rugged coast in a very, mind was sort of in a very pensive attitude, deciding what he was going to do. And so he wrote this hymn that afternoon. Following the walk, went back to his room and wrote this hymn. And it was never sung publicly until his funeral, when he died in this little English village. And the choir sang that for the first time. So abide with me, and I have a personal story to tell about this particular piece of music. And Kim and Rosemary Dahlberg are online with us. They were members of the church in Fulton when I was there, and they should recognize this name that I'm going to share. Susan and I were appointed there and went there July 1st. For the first few months, I didn't have any funerals. Come along about October was my first funeral there. So anyway, I go to the funeral home, and the funeral was for a gentleman named Harold Palmer, who was in a nursing home at the time in Oswego. Harold, over the years, every Palm Sunday, had played his trumpet to the Palms. Imagine that. 150 people singing the Palms with a trumpet.
Yeah.
That had to be pretty impressive. But he hadn't done it in recent years because he was in the nursing home. Well, anyway, Harold had a musical background, and he and his cousins did some gigs on Saturday nights here, there, and everywhere. So it was Harold who died. The funeral director was Paul Foster, and Paul came over to me and he said, "John, is it okay if some of the family participates in the service?" Well, back then, that wasn't a thing. Nowadays, any mix of people, they sing, they speak, they read poems, a whole bunch of stuff goes on. So now it's become a very appropriate question for the pastor to say, is there anybody who would like to participate or say a word? But back then, it wasn't. So here I am, the new pastor on the block. You want to do what you think is the appropriate thing, but you're thinking, once I say yes, I've lost control of that part of whatever is going to happen. So anyway, I reluctantly say, yeah, okay. So the next day, we're partway through the funeral in the funeral home, and Harold is in an open casket up front, and there's a trumpet in the open casket. His cousin says, he's up to speak. I'm sitting down, taking this all in. He said, I would like, as my participation in this service, to take Harold's trumpet and play Abide With Me. He took the trumpet And you know, you would figure somebody playing a trumpet, wouldn't you need a little warm-up time? Nothing. He took that trumpet and put it to his lips and played, "Abide with me." And it was the most perfect rendition I had ever heard. And then it's my time to speak.
How do you follow that?
What do you say to top that?
Sure.
And when the piece was done, he took the trumpet and walked to the casket, and it was buried with Harold. And that's my best recollection of Abide with me. And I say we sing it so frequently, but tonight we are going to sing it. So let's do stanzas 1 and 2. It's number 700. So that ends the singing part. I said before, there are lots of ways to be devotional. You can be devotional by reading a book. You can be devotional in the midst of silence, in the midst of prayer. A lot of different ways, but you can also be devotional in your songs. And one of the horrendous things that the pandemic has caused is the lessening of our singing together. For a while, we weren't even in a church building to sing together. And we depended on John sitting at his picnic table with this little Neanderthal computer system we had rigged up, but we could
And my
hear
drinking
John.
glass.
Yes, John would clink the glass to get a C or a D or whatever you were looking for.
E-natural.
Yeah.
E-natural.
And even now, with the pandemic winding down, so it seems sometimes, we have fewer number of people in the pews, and singing is not the same as it was before the pandemic. Now, whether it'll ever return to that, I don't know. If it does, it's really slow in coming. Many of our churches have lost their choirs for a variety of reasons, but the pandemic has certainly impacted that too. So we've had fewer opportunities to do music together as kind of a devotional time. And that's why I wanted to reach out to our music folks and say, could we do this?
Yeah.
And this could be our Maundy, Thursday worship together. So I should have explained that rationale at the beginning, but you hear it at the end. So anyway, I have a benediction prayer there, and I wondered if we could all join in that together. And then if you want, there are some people online. If you wanted to walk over there and say hello to some familiar faces, we can do that. We thank you, O God,
for the gift of music, for the rich inspiration of past ages, and for the meaning such music gives to our lives. May our devotion, through these hymns of faith, glorify Almighty God, through Jesus Christ.
Amen. Well, thank you for coming.
Thank you,
It's
John.
really hard to get people into church these days. So when you come on a Thursday night instead of a Sunday morning, that's really a nice effort on your part, so thank you.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Great.